The story begins in a bustling city, where a dedicated police officer, known for his integrity and hard work, finds himself at the center of a web of deceit. This officer, a black man in his mid-30s, had always believed in the system he served. He joined the force to make a difference, to protect and serve his community, and to be a role model for young people who looked like him. But little did he know, the very system he trusted would soon turn against him. The officer had been working in the precinct for over a decade. He was well respected by his colleagues, or so he thought. He had a reputation for being fair, for going above and beyond to help those in need, and for never backing down from a challenge. But behind his back, a few of his fellow officers had grown jealous of his success. They didn't like that he was getting recognition for his work, and they didn't like that he was rising through the ranks faster than they were. They decided to do something about it. One evening, after a long shift, the officer was called into his supervisor's office. He thought it was just a routine meeting, maybe to discuss a new case or to get feedback on his recent work. But as soon as he walked in, he could sense that something was off. His supervisor, a man he had always respected, had a serious look on his face. He told the officer to sit down, and then he dropped the bombshell. "We've received some serious allegations against you," the supervisor said, his voice cold and detached. "There's evidence that you've been involved in some illegal activities. We have no choice but to suspend you pending an investigation." The officer was stunned. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Illegal activities? What was he talking about? He had always followed the rules, always done his job by the book. He tried to protest, to explain that there must be some mistake, but his supervisor cut him off. "I'm sorry," the supervisor said, though he didn't sound sorry at all. "This is out of my hands. You'll need to turn in your badge and gun immediately." The officer left the office in a daze. He felt like the ground had been ripped out from under him. How could this be happening? Who would do this to him? And why? As he walked out of the precinct, he noticed a few of his colleagues whispering and glancing in his direction. He couldn't hear what they were saying, but he could tell by the looks on their faces that they knew something he didn't. He felt a knot tighten in his stomach. This wasn't just a mistake. This was a setup. Over the next few days, the officer tried to make sense of what had happened. He reached out to a few trusted friends on the force, but they either avoided his calls or gave him vague answers. He felt isolated, betrayed. He knew he had to do something, but he didn't know where to start. Then, one evening, he received a phone call from an unexpected source. It was a former colleague, someone who had left the force a few years ago. The man sounded nervous, but he had information that could change everything. "I know what's going on," the former colleague said. "And I know who's behind it. But you need to be careful. These people are dangerous, and they'll do whatever it takes to protect themselves." The officer listened intently as the man explained what he knew. It turned out that a small group of officers within the precinct had been involved in some shady dealings for years. They had been stealing money, planting evidence, and covering up their crimes. But when the officer started getting too close to the truth, they decided to take him out of the picture. They fabricated evidence against him, spread rumors, and manipulated the system to make it look like he was the one who was corrupt. The officer was furious. He couldn't believe that the people he had worked alongside, the people he had trusted, could do something like this. But he also knew that he couldn't let them get away with it. He had to fight back, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been wronged by these corrupt officers. He spent the next few days gathering as much information as he could. He reached out to other former colleagues, dug through old case files, and even risked his safety to meet with informants who had information about the corrupt officers. It was dangerous work, and he knew that if he was caught, things could get even worse. But he didn't care. He was determined to expose the truth, no matter the cost. As he pieced together the evidence, he realized just how deep the corruption went. it wasn't just a few bad apples. The entire precinct was infected, from the lowest-ranking officers all the way up to the top. And if he was going to take them down, he would need to be smart, strategic, and above all, careful. The officer knew he couldn't do this alone. He needed allies, people who were willing to stand up for what was right, even if it meant going against their own colleagues. He reached out to a few trusted friends, both inside and outside the force, and together they began to formulate a plan. But even as he worked to expose the corruption, the officer couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He noticed strange cars parked outside his house, received anonymous threats, and even found his apartment had been broken into. The corrupt officers were clearly trying to intimidate him, to make him back down. But it only made him more determined. The stage was set for a showdown. The officer knew that he was risking everything, his career, his safety, even his life, but he also knew that he had no choice. He had to fight for justice, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been wronged by the corrupt system. And so, with a steely resolve, the officer prepared to make his next move. A move that would shake the entire department to its core. The officer knew that if he was going to expose the corruption within his precinct, he needed solid evidence. Rumors and hearsay wouldn't be enough to bring down the powerful figures involved. He needed proof, documents, recordings, anything that could hold up in court. But gathering that evidence wouldn't be easy. The corrupt officers were careful, and they had been covering their tracks for years. The officer would have to be smarter, bolder, and more resourceful than they were. He started by revisiting old cases he had worked on, cases where things hadn't quite added up. There was one in particular that stood out, a drug bust from a few years ago. At the time, the officer had been proud of the arrest. They had seized a large amount of drugs and cash, and the suspect had been sentenced to a long prison term. But now, looking back, the officer noticed something strange. The evidence had been almost too perfect, as if it had been planted. And the suspect had insisted on his innocence, claiming he had been set up. The officer had dismissed it as the usual excuses, but now he wasn't so sure. He decided to dig deeper. He reached out to the suspect's lawyer, who was surprised but willing to help. The lawyer provided him with copies of the case files, including photos of the evidence and transcripts of the trial. As the officer went through the files, he noticed something odd. The drugs and cash had been found in a hidden compartment in the suspect's car, but the compartment looked brand new, as if it had been installed recently. And the fingerprints on the drugs didn't match the suspect's. The officer's heart raced. This was the break he had been looking for. But he knew that one case wouldn't be enough. He needed more. He began reaching out to other lawyers, journalists, and even former suspects who had been arrested by the corrupt officers. Many were hesitant to talk, afraid of retaliation, but a few were willing to share their stories. Slowly, a pattern began to emerge. The same group of officers was involved in multiple cases where evidence had been tampered with, witnesses had been coerced, and suspects had been framed. It was a systematic abuse of power, and it had been going on for years. The officer also started keeping a close eye on his former colleagues. He knew it was risky, but he had no other choice. He began following them after work, taking notes on where they went and who they met. He even managed to plant a small recording device in the break room at the precinct, hoping to catch them discussing their illegal activities. It was a dangerous game, and he knew that if he was caught, it would be the end of him. But he was willing to take the risk. One evening, his surveillance paid off. He followed one of the corrupt officers to a rundown bar on the outskirts of the city. The officer waited outside, watching as the man met with a known drug dealer. He couldn't hear what they were saying. But he could see them exchanging something, money, drugs, or maybe both. The officer quickly snapped a few photos with his phone, careful not to be seen. This was the kind of evidence he needed, proof that the corrupt officers were working with criminals. But as he was leaving, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Another car was parked nearby, and inside was one of his former colleagues. The man was watching him, a smirk on his face. The officer realized that he had been followed. His heart pounded as he quickly got into his car and drove away, his mind racing. They knew he was onto them, and now they would be even more careful. The next few days were tense. The officer felt like he was being watched wherever he went. He noticed strange cars parked outside his house, and he received several anonymous phone calls, threatening him to back off. But he refused to be intimidated. He knew that if he gave up now, the corrupt officers would win, and justice would never be served. He decided to take a bold step. He reached out to a journalist he had worked with in the past, a woman known for her investigative reporting. She was skeptical at first, but when he showed her the evidence he had gathered, she agreed to help. Together, they began putting together a story that would expose the corruption within the precinct. It was a risky move. If the story was published before they had enough evidence, the corrupt officers could destroy the evidence and cover their tracks. But the officer knew it was a risk he had to take. As the journalist worked on the story, the officer continued gathering evidence. He managed to get his hands on internal precinct documents, including financial records that showed large sums of money being funneled into secret accounts. He also found emails between the corrupt officers, discussing their illegal activities in detail. It was damning evidence, and it was enough to bring them down. But just as they were preparing to go public, disaster struck. The journalist called the officer in a panic. Her computer had been hacked, and all the files related to the story had been deleted. She had backups, but it would take time to recover them. The officer knew that time was something they didn't have. The corrupt officers were clearly onto them, and they would stop at nothing to protect themselves. The officer felt a wave of despair. He had come so far, only to be thwarted at the last moment. But he refused to give up. He knew that he had to keep fighting, no matter how difficult it was. He decided to take matters into his own hands. He would confront the corrupt officers directly, face to face. It was a dangerous move, but he had no other choice. He arranged a meeting with the ringleader of the corrupt group, a high-ranking officer who had been with the precinct for decades. The man was surprised but agreed to meet, thinking he could intimidate the officer into silence. They met in a secluded location, away from prying eyes. The atmosphere was tense as the two men faced each other. "You've been causing a lot of trouble," the corrupt officer said, his voice cold and menacing. "You need to stop, before things get ugly." The officer stood his ground. "I know what you've been doing," he said. "And I have the evidence to prove it. If you don't turn yourself in, I'll make sure everyone knows the truth." The corrupt officer laughed. "You think you can take me down? You're just one man. You don't stand a chance." But the officer wasn't backing down. "We'll see about that," he said, his voice steady. "This ends now." The meeting ended in a stalemate, but the officer knew that the battle was far from over. He had made his move, and now it was up to the corrupt officers to respond. He knew that they would come after him with everything they had, but he was ready. He had the evidence, and he had the truth on his side. As he drove home that night, the officer felt a sense of determination. He knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but he was prepared to fight for justice, no matter the cost. The next move was his, and he was ready to shake the entire department to its core. The officer knew that his meeting with the corrupt ringleader had escalated the situation. He had thrown down the gauntlet, and now there was no turning back. The corrupt officers would stop at nothing to silence him, but he was equally determined to expose them. The stakes were higher than ever, and the tension was palpable. The morning after the confrontation, the officer woke up to find his car vandalized. The tires were slashed, and the words, "Back off," were spray-painted across the hood. It was a clear message, but it only strengthened his resolve. He knew they were trying to scare him, but he wasn't going to let them win. He cleaned up the mess, got his car fixed, and continued with his plan. He decided to take a calculated risk. He reached out to a few trusted colleagues who were still on the force, officers he believed were clean and could be relied upon. He needed allies, people who could help him gather more evidence and protect him from the corrupt officers. It was a delicate operation. He had to be careful not to tip off the wrong people. One misstep, and everything could fall apart. One of the officers he approached was a young detective who had always looked up to him. The detective was shocked when he heard about the corruption but agreed to help. Together, they began working in secret, gathering more evidence and building a case against the corrupt officers. They knew they had to move quickly before the corrupt officers could cover their tracks. Meanwhile, the corrupt officers were growing increasingly desperate. They knew the officer was onto them, and they couldn't afford to let him expose their crimes. They began to tighten their grip on the precinct, intimidating anyone who might be sympathetic to the officer's cause. They spread rumors about him, claiming he was unstable and had a personal vendetta against the department. They even tried to frame him for a crime he didn't commit, planting drugs in his locker and calling in an anonymous tip. But the officer was prepared. He had anticipated their moves and had taken precautions. He had hidden copies of all the evidence in multiple locations, both physical and digital. He had also informed a few trusted friends outside the department about what was going on, ensuring that if anything happened to him, the truth would still come out. The tension reached a boiling point when the officer received a phone call from the journalist he had been working with. She had managed to recover the deleted files and was ready to publish the story. But she warned him that it was risky. Once the story was out, there would be no going back. The corrupt officers would do everything in their power to discredit it, and they might even try to harm him. The officer knew it was a risk, but he also knew it was the only way to bring the corruption to light. He gave the journalist the green light, and within hours, the story was published. It was explosive, detailing the years of corruption within the precinct and naming the officers involved. The public was outraged, and the media quickly picked up the story. The corrupt officers were caught off guard. They had underestimated the officer and hadn't expected him to go public so soon. They scrambled to contain the damage, holding press conferences and denying the allegations. But the evidence was too strong, and their lies only made things worse. As the story gained traction, the officer found himself in the spotlight. He was hailed as a hero by some, but others viewed him as a traitor. He received threats from both the corrupt officers and their allies, but he also found support from unexpected places. Community leaders, activists, and even some politicians rallied behind him, calling for a full investigation into the precinct. The department was in chaos. Internal Affairs launched an investigation, and the corrupt officers were placed on administrative leave. But the officer knew that the fight was far from over. The corrupt officers still had powerful friends, and they would do everything in their power to protect themselves. One evening, as the officer was leaving a meeting with his lawyer, he was approached by a man he didn't recognize. The man handed him an envelope and quickly walked away. Inside the envelope was a USB drive and a note that read, "You'll need this." The officer took the USB drive home and plugged it into his computer. What he found shocked him. It contained hours of audio recordings, conversations between the corrupt officers discussing their illegal activities in detail. It was the smoking gun he had been looking for, irrefutable proof of their crimes. But before he could act on the new evidence, he received a phone call from the young detective who had been helping him. The detective sounded panicked. "They know about the USB drive," he said. "They're coming for you. You need to get out of there, now." The officer didn't hesitate. He grabbed the USB drive, along with the rest of the evidence, and left his apartment. As he drove away, he noticed a car following him. He tried to lose it, but the driver was persistent. The officer knew he had to act fast. He drove to a safe house he had prepared in advance, a small, nondescript apartment where he could lay low. Once he was safely inside, he contacted the journalist and his lawyer. They arranged to meet the next day to discuss their next steps. The officer knew that the USB drive was the key to bringing down the corrupt officers, but he also knew that it was dangerous. The corrupt officers would stop at nothing to get their hands on it. That night, as the officer lay in the safe house, he couldn't sleep. His mind raced with thoughts of what was to come. He knew that the next few days would be critical. He had the evidence, but he needed to use it wisely. He needed to stay one step ahead of the corrupt officers and their allies. The next morning, he met with the journalist and his lawyer. They reviewed the contents of the USB drive and discussed their strategy. They decided to release the recordings to the media, along with a statement from the officer. It was a bold move, but they knew it was the only way to ensure that the truth came out. As the recordings were released, the public outcry grew even louder. The corrupt officers were exposed for who they truly were, and the pressure on the department became unbearable. The internal affairs investigation intensified, and more officers were implicated in the scandal. But the officer knew that the fight wasn't over yet. The corrupt officers were still powerful, and they would do everything in their power to protect themselves. He had to stay vigilant, to keep fighting until justice was served. As he prepared for the next phase of the battle, the officer felt a sense of determination. He had come too far to back down now. He had the evidence, he had the truth, and he had the support of the people. He was ready to take on the corrupt officers and shake the entire department to its core. The release of the USB drive recordings sent shockwaves through the department and the city. The public was outraged, and the media was relentless. Every news outlet was running the story, and the corrupt officers were facing intense scrutiny. The officer, now a symbol of courage and integrity, found himself at the center of a storm. But while the public celebrated his bravery, he knew the battle was far from over. The corrupt officers were desperate, and desperate people were dangerous. The department was in chaos. Internal Affairs had launched a full-scale investigation, and several high-ranking officers were suspended. The city's mayor held a press conference, promising a thorough and transparent investigation. But the officer knew that promises weren't enough. He had seen how deep the corruption ran, and he wasn't going to rest until every last one of the guilty parties was held accountable. The corrupt officers, however, weren't going down without a fight. They hired expensive lawyers, held private meetings, and used their connections to try to discredit the officer. They claimed the recordings were fabricated, that the officer had a personal vendetta, and that he was trying to destroy the department. But the evidence was too strong, and their lies only made them look more guilty. The officer, meanwhile, was lying low. He stayed in the safe house, only venturing out for essential meetings. He knew the corrupt officers were still out there, and they would do anything to silence him. He received constant threats, anonymous calls, messages, and even a few attempts to break into the safe house. But he wasn't alone. The young detective who had been helping him was now working around the clock to ensure his safety. Community leaders and activists also rallied around him, offering their support and protection. One evening, the officer received a visit from an unexpected ally, a retired judge who had been following the case closely. The judge was a respected figure in the city, known for his integrity and fairness. He had read the officer's story and wanted to help. "You've done something extraordinary," the judge said. "But you can't do this alone. You need a legal team that can take this to the next level. Let me help you." The officer was grateful but cautious. He had learned the hard way that not everyone could be trusted. But after a long conversation, he realized the judge was genuine. Together, they began assembling a team of lawyers, investigators, and experts who could help build an airtight case against the corrupt officers. As the legal team got to work, the officer focused on staying one step ahead of his enemies. He knew the corrupt officers would try to destroy the evidence or discredit him, so he made multiple copies of everything and stored them in secure locations. He also reached out to other whistleblowers within the department, encouraging them to come forward. Slowly but surely, more officers began to speak out, adding their voices to the growing chorus demanding justice. But the corrupt officers weren't idle. They used their influence to launch a counter-campaign, spreading rumors and misinformation. They even tried to bribe some of the whistleblowers, offering them money and promotions in exchange for their silence. A few officers succumbed to the pressure, but most stood firm, inspired by the officers' courage. The tension reached a breaking point when one of the whistleblowers was attacked. The officer received a frantic call late one night from the young detective. "They've gone too far," the detective said. "One of our guys was jumped outside his house. He's in the hospital, but he's alive. They're sending a message." The officer felt a surge of anger. He knew the attack was meant to intimidate him and the other whistleblowers, but it only strengthened his resolve. He called an emergency meeting with his legal team and the journalist. They decided to escalate their efforts, releasing more evidence to the media and putting pressure on the department to take immediate action. The next day, the journalist published a follow-up story, detailing the attack on the whistleblower and exposing the corrupt officers' attempts to silence their critics. The public was furious, and protests began to erupt outside the precinct. People demanded accountability, and the pressure on the department became unbearable. The department's leadership, realizing they could no longer ignore the situation, called for an emergency meeting. The officer was invited to attend, along with his legal team. It was a high-stakes meeting, and everyone knew it could determine the outcome of the case. The meeting was tense. The department's leadership tried to downplay the situation, claiming they were handling it internally. But the officer and his team weren't having it. They presented the evidence, including the USB drive recordings and testimonies from the whistleblowers. They demanded immediate action, including the arrest of the corrupt officers and a complete overhaul of the department's leadership. The department's leadership was cornered. They couldn't deny the evidence, and they knew the public was watching. Reluctantly, they agreed to take action. The corrupt officers were arrested, and a special task force was formed to investigate the department's practices. It was a major victory, but the officer knew it wasn't the end. The corrupt officers still had powerful friends, and the fight for justice was far from over. But for the first time in months, he allowed himself to feel a glimmer of hope. He had taken on the system and won the first round. Now, he had to prepare for the next phase of the battle. As he left the meeting, the officer was approached by the young detective. The detective looked exhausted but determined. "We did it," the detective said. "But this is just the beginning. They're not going to give up easily." The officer nodded. "I know. But neither are we. We've come too far to back down now." The two men shook hands, united in their mission. The officer knew the road ahead would be difficult, but he was ready. He had the evidence, the truth, and the support of the people. He was determined to see this through, no matter what it took. As he walked away, the officer felt a sense of purpose. He had started this fight to clear his name, but it had become something much bigger. It was a fight for justice, for accountability, and for the soul of the department. And he wasn't going to stop until he had shaken the entire system to its core. With the corrupt officers arrested and the department in turmoil, the officer knew the fight was far from over. The legal battle ahead would be grueling, and the corrupt officers still had powerful allies who would stop at nothing to protect them. But the officer was ready. He had the evidence, the truth, and a growing army of supporters. Now, it was time to take the fight to the courtroom. The first step was to ensure that the case against the corrupt officers was airtight. The officers' legal team worked tirelessly, reviewing every piece of evidence, interviewing witnesses, and preparing for the trial. They knew the defense would try to discredit the evidence and attack the officer's credibility, so they had to be prepared for anything. The trial began with a media frenzy. Reporters from across the country descended on the courthouse, eager to cover the explosive case. The officer, now a public figure, was both celebrated and scrutinized. He knew that every move he made would be under the microscope, and he had to be careful not to give the defense any ammunition. The prosecution's case was strong. They presented the USB drive recordings, which clearly showed the corrupt officers discussing their illegal activities. They also called several whistleblowers to the stand, including the young detective who had been helping the officer. Their testimonies were powerful, painting a picture of a department riddled with corruption and abuse of power. But the defense was relentless. They attacked the credibility of the whistleblowers, claiming they had personal grudges against the defendants. They also tried to discredit the recordings, bringing in their own experts to argue that the audio had been tampered with. It was a tough fight, but the officers' legal team held their ground. One of the most dramatic moments of the trial came when the officer himself took the stand. The courtroom was packed as he walked to the witness box, his face calm but determined. The defense attorney, a slick and aggressive lawyer, immediately went on the attack. "Isn't it true," the attorney began, "that you have a personal vendetta against my clients? That this entire case is nothing more than a witch hunt?" The officer remained calm. "No," he said firmly. "This is about justice. It's about holding people accountable for their actions." The attorney pressed on, trying to rattle him, but the officer stood his ground. He answered every question with honesty and clarity, never losing his composure. When the defense attorney finally sat down, the courtroom was silent. The officer had made an impression, and it was clear that the jury was paying attention. As the trial progressed, the prosecution continued to build their case. They presented financial records showing large sums of money being funneled into secret accounts, emails between the corrupt officers discussing their illegal activities, and testimonies from victims who had been framed or coerced. The evidence was overwhelming, and it was clear that the corrupt officers were in serious trouble. But the defense wasn't giving up. They called their own witnesses, including former colleagues of the officer who claimed he was unstable and had a history of making false accusations. They also tried to shift the blame, arguing that the corrupt officers were just following orders from higher-ups. It was a desperate move, but it showed how far they were willing to go to protect their clients. The trial dragged on for weeks, with both sides fighting tooth and nail. The officer, though exhausted, remained focused. He knew that the outcome of this trial would have far-reaching consequences, not just for him, but for the entire department and the city. He couldn't afford to let up. Finally, the day of the closing arguments arrived. The prosecution went first, summarizing the evidence and urging the jury to deliver a verdict of guilty. "This case is about more than just these defendants," the prosecutor said. "It's about the integrity of our justice system. It's about sending a message that no one is above the law." The defense, in their closing argument, tried to sow doubt. "This case is built on lies and personal vendettas," the defense attorney said. "My clients are innocent, and I urge you to see through the smoke and mirrors." The jury deliberated for days, and the tension was unbearable. The officer spent the time in the safe house, trying to stay calm but unable to shake the feeling of dread. He knew that if the corrupt officers were acquitted, it would be a devastating blow, not just to him, but to everyone who had fought for justice. Finally, the verdict was in. The courtroom was packed as the jury filed in, their faces unreadable. The officer sat in the front row, his heart pounding as the foreperson stood to deliver the verdict. "We, the jury," the foreperson began, "find the defendants guilty on all counts." The courtroom erupted. The officer felt a wave of relief wash over him, but he knew it wasn't over yet. The corrupt officers were led out in handcuffs, their faces filled with anger and disbelief. The judge set a date for sentencing, and the officer knew that the fight wasn't truly over until they were behind bars. As he left the courthouse, the officer was surrounded by reporters and supporters. He gave a brief statement, thanking everyone who had stood by him and emphasizing that this was a victory for justice. But he also knew that the work wasn't done. The department still needed major reforms, and there were likely more corrupt officers who had yet to be exposed. That evening, the officer met with his legal team and the young detective to discuss their next steps. They knew that the sentencing would be another battle, and they had to be prepared for the corrupt officers to appeal the verdict. But for now, they allowed themselves a moment to celebrate. They had won a major victory, and it was a testament to their hard work and determination. As the officer lay in bed that night, he thought about everything he had been through. It had been a long and difficult journey, but he had never given up. He had fought for justice, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been wronged by the corrupt system. And he knew that, no matter what challenges lay ahead, he would continue to fight. The next phase of the battle would be just as tough, but the officer was ready. He had the evidence, the truth, and the support of the people. And he was determined to see this through to the end. The guilty verdict was a monumental victory, but the officer knew the fight wasn't over. The corrupt officers had been found guilty, but they still had to be sentenced. And given their connections and resources, the officer knew they would pull every string to avoid serious consequences. The sentencing hearing would be another battle, one that could determine whether justice would truly be served. The weeks leading up to the sentencing were tense. The corrupt officer's legal team filed motion after motion, trying to delay the hearing and reduce the charges. They argued that their clients had been unfairly targeted, that the evidence was circumstantial, and that the trial had been a media circus. But the judge, a no-nonsense veteran of the bench, wasn't having it. She denied their motions and set a firm date for the sentencing. The officer spent those weeks preparing. He worked closely with the prosecution team, helping them craft a powerful argument for a harsh sentence. He also reached out to the victims of the corrupt officers, people who had been framed, coerced, or otherwise wronged by their actions. Their testimonies would be crucial in showing the judge the full extent of the damage the corrupt officers had caused. The day of the sentencing arrived, and the courtroom was packed. Reporters, activists, and community members filled the seats, all eager to see how the case would conclude. The officer sat in the front row, flanked by his legal team and the young detective who had been his steadfast ally. He felt a mix of emotions, relief that the trial was over, anxiety about the outcome, and determination to see this through to the end. The corrupt officers were brought in, their faces grim. They had lost the swagger they once had, but there was still a defiant glint in their eyes. They knew this was their last chance to avoid prison, and they were prepared to fight. The prosecution went first, presenting a detailed account of the officers' crimes. They showed how the officers had abused their power, framed innocent people, and enriched themselves at the expense of the community. They also presented emotional testimonies from the victims, who spoke about how their lives had been destroyed by the officers' actions. One woman broke down as she described how she had lost custody of her children after being falsely accused of a crime. A young man talked about spending years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. Their stories were heartbreaking, and they left a profound impact on everyone in the courtroom. The defense, in their turn, tried to paint the corrupt officers as victims of circumstance. They argued that the officers had been under immense pressure, that they had made mistakes but didn't deserve to be punished so severely. They also brought in character witnesses, friends and family members who spoke about the officers' good deeds and contributions to the community. It was a desperate attempt to sway the judge, but it fell flat in the face of the overwhelming evidence against them. Finally, it was time for the judge to deliver the sentence. The courtroom was silent as she stood, her face stern. She began by summarizing the case, highlighting the severity of the officers' crimes and the impact they had on the community. Then, she turned to the officers. "You were entrusted with a great responsibility," she said, her voice firm. "You were supposed to protect and serve, but instead, you abused your power for personal gain. You betrayed the trust of the people, and you caused irreparable harm to countless lives. For that, you must be held accountable. She then handed down the sentences. The ringleader of the corrupt group, a high-ranking officer who had orchestrated much of the illegal activity, was given a 25-year prison term. The others received sentences ranging from 10 to 20 years. It was a harsh but fair punishment, and it sent a clear message: no one was above the law. The courtroom erupted in a mix of cheers and tears. The officer felt a surge of relief and satisfaction. Justice had been served, and the corrupt officers would finally face the consequences of their actions. But as he looked around the courtroom, he knew this wasn't the end. The department was still broken, and there was much work to be done to rebuild trust and ensure that something like this never happened again. After the hearing, the officer held a press conference outside the courthouse. He thanked everyone who had supported him, the whistleblowers, the legal team, the journalist, and the community. He also emphasized that this was just the beginning. Today, we took a big step toward justice, he said. But our work isn't done. We need to reform the department, to make sure that no one else has to go through what we did. This is a victory, but it's also a call to action. The crowd cheered, and the officer felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had started this fight to clear his name, but it had become something much bigger. It was a fight for justice, for accountability, and for the soul of the department. In the weeks that followed, the officer worked tirelessly to push for reforms. He met with community leaders, politicians, and department officials, advocating for changes that would increase transparency and accountability. He also continued to support the whistleblowers, ensuring that they were protected and that their voices were heard. But the fight wasn't without its challenges. The corrupt officers' allies were still out there, and they didn't take kindly to the officer's efforts. He received more threats, and there were a few close calls where he narrowly avoided danger. But he refused to back down. He knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but he was determined to see it through. One evening, as he was leaving a community meeting, the officer was approached by a young boy. The boy looked up at him with wide eyes and said, "You're my hero." The officer knelt down and smiled. "Thank you," he said. "But you know what? You can be a hero too. All you have to do is stand up for what's right, even when it's hard." The boy nodded, and the officer felt a surge of hope. He knew that his fight wasn't just about him, it was about creating a better future for the next generation. And as long as there were people willing to stand up for justice, he knew that change was possible. As he walked away, the officer felt a sense of peace. He had come a long way, and there was still much to do. But he was ready. He had the evidence, the truth, and the support of the people. And he was determined to see this through to the end. The sentencing of the corrupt officers was a turning point, but the officer knew the real work was just beginning. The department was in shambles, and the community's trust in law enforcement had been shattered. Rebuilding that trust would take time, effort, and a commitment to real change. The officer was determined to lead that effort, but he also knew he couldn't do it alone. In the weeks following the sentencing, the officer became a key figure in the push for reform. He worked closely with community leaders, activists, and city officials to develop a plan to overhaul the department. They focused on increasing transparency, improving accountability, and ensuring that the department reflected the community it served. It was a daunting task, but the officer was fueled by the support of the people who had stood by him throughout his fight. One of the first steps was to establish an independent oversight committee to monitor the department's activities. The committee was made up of community members, legal experts, and former law enforcement officers who had a reputation for integrity. Their job was to investigate complaints, review department policies, and ensure that any misconduct was dealt with swiftly and fairly. The officer knew that this was crucial to rebuilding trust, and he made sure the committee had the resources and authority it needed to do its job effectively. The officer also pushed for changes in how officers were trained. He advocated for more emphasis on community policing, de-escalation techniques, and cultural sensitivity. He believed that if officers were better trained and more connected to the communities they served, they would be less likely to abuse their power. He also called for regular psychological evaluations and stress management programs to ensure that officers were mentally and emotionally fit for the job. But not everyone was on board with the reforms. Some officers resisted the changes, feeling that they were being unfairly targeted because of the actions of a few bad apples. The officer understood their concerns, but he also knew that the department couldn't move forward without addressing the systemic issues that had allowed the corruption to flourish. He held town hall meetings and open forums to listen to the officers' concerns and explain the importance of the reforms. Slowly but surely, he began to win them over. The community, however, was more receptive. People were eager to see real change, and they rallied behind the officers' efforts. They attended meetings, volunteered for the oversight committee, and worked with the department to develop programs that would strengthen the relationship between law enforcement and the community. It was a collaborative effort, and the officer was heartened by the progress they were making. But the road to reform wasn't without its challenges. The officer faced constant pushback from the corrupt officer's allies, who were still trying to undermine his efforts. They spread rumors, filed frivolous lawsuits, and even tried to sabotage the oversight committee's work. But the officer refused to be deterred. He knew that the fight for justice was never easy, and he was prepared to face whatever obstacles came his way. One of the most significant challenges came when the officer was called to testify before a state legislative committee. The committee was considering a bill that would mandate police reforms across the state, and the officer's testimony was crucial. He spent days preparing, knowing that his words could have a far-reaching impact. The day of the hearing arrived, and the officer walked into the committee room with a sense of purpose. He was greeted by a mix of supporters and opponents, but he remained focused. When it was his turn to speak, he stood at the podium and looked out at the committee members. "I've seen firsthand what happens when a department loses its way," he began. "I've seen the damage that corruption and abuse of power can do, not just to the community, but to the officers who are trying to do their jobs with integrity. But I've also seen what can happen when we come together to fight for justice. We've made progress, but there's still much work to be done. This bill is a step in the right direction, and I urge you to pass it." His testimony was powerful, and it resonated with the committee members. They asked him tough questions, but he answered them with honesty and clarity. By the end of the hearing, it was clear that his words had made an impact. The bill passed with overwhelming support, and the officer knew that it was a major victory for the reform movement. But even as he celebrated the victory, the officer knew that the fight wasn't over. The reforms would take time to implement, and there would be challenges along the way. He also knew that there were still corrupt officers who had yet to be exposed, and he was determined to bring them to justice. One evening, as he was leaving a community meeting, the officer was approached by a young woman. She looked nervous but determined. "I need to talk to you," she said. "It's about my brother. He was framed by one of the officers who wasn't arrested. I have proof." The officer listened intently as the woman explained her story. Her brother had been arrested for a crime he didn't commit, and she had evidence that the arresting officer had planted the evidence. It was a bombshell revelation, and the officer knew that it could lead to another major scandal. He thanked the woman for her courage and promised to look into the matter. He knew that it would be another difficult fight, but he was ready. He had come too far to back down now. As he drove home that night, the officer felt a mix of emotions. He was proud of the progress they had made, but he also knew that there was still much work to do. The fight for justice was never-ending, but he was determined to see it through. The next morning, he met with his legal team and the young detective to discuss the new case. They knew it would be a tough fight, but they were ready. They had the evidence, the truth, and the support of the people. And they were determined to see this through to the end. As the officer prepared for the next phase of the battle, he felt a sense of purpose. He had started this fight to clear his name, but it had become something much bigger. It was a fight for justice, for accountability, and for the soul of the department. And he wasn't going to stop until he had shaken the entire system to its core. The officer's fight for justice had come a long way, but the battle wasn't over yet. The new case, the young woman's revelation about her brother being framed, opened a fresh chapter in the ongoing struggle to root out corruption. This case was different, though. It wasn't just about exposing one bad officer, it was about dismantling the remnants of the corrupt network that still lurked within the department. The officer knew this would be his toughest challenge yet, but he was ready. He had the evidence, the truth, and the unwavering support of the community. Now, it was time to finish what he had started. The officer and his team began by carefully reviewing the evidence the young woman had provided. It was damning: photos, documents, and even a recorded conversation between the officer who had framed her brother and another corrupt colleague. The evidence pointed to a wider conspiracy, one that involved officers who had managed to evade scrutiny during the initial investigation. The officer knew that if he could bring these individuals to justice, it would be the final blow to the corruption that had plagued the department for years. But he also knew that this case would be dangerous. The corrupt officers who were still free would stop at nothing to protect themselves. The officer and his team took extra precautions, securing the evidence in multiple locations and ensuring that their movements were closely monitored. They also reached out to trusted allies in the department and the community, building a network of support that would help them navigate the challenges ahead. The first step was to present the evidence to the Oversight Committee. The committee, now fully operational and respected for its impartiality, took the case seriously. They launched an immediate investigation, working closely with the officer and his team to gather more evidence and identify all the individuals involved. It was a painstaking process, but the officer knew that every detail mattered. They couldn't afford to make any mistakes. As the investigation progressed, the officer began to feel the pressure mounting. The corrupt officers, realizing that their network was under threat, launched a counteroffensive. They spread rumors about the officer, claiming that he was fabricating evidence and targeting innocent officers. They also tried to intimidate witnesses, threatening them with retaliation if they cooperated with the investigation. But the officer and his team were prepared. They had anticipated these tactics and had taken steps to protect the witnesses and ensure their safety. One evening, as the officer was leaving a meeting with the Oversight Committee, he received a chilling message. It was a photo of his house, with the words, "Back off or else," scrawled across it. The officer felt a surge of anger, but he also knew that this was a sign of desperation. The corrupt officers were scared, and that meant he was getting closer to the truth. He reported the threat to the Oversight Committee and increased security around his home and workplace. He also reached out to the young detective, who had become his closest ally, to discuss their next steps. They decided to accelerate the investigation, knowing that time was of the essence. The breakthrough came when one of the corrupt officers, realizing that the net was closing in, decided to cooperate. He reached out to the Oversight Committee, offering to provide information in exchange for immunity. The officer and his team were skeptical. They knew that the man was likely trying to save himself, but they also knew that his testimony could be crucial. They agreed to hear him out. The corrupt officer's testimony was explosive. He named names, provided details about illegal activities, and even revealed the existence of a secret fund that had been used to bribe officials and cover up crimes. It was the smoking gun the officer had been looking for. With this new evidence, the Oversight Committee was able to issue arrest warrants for several high-ranking officers who had managed to evade justice until now. The arrest sent shockwaves through the department and the city. The corrupt officers, who had once seemed untouchable, were now facing the full force of the law. The media coverage was intense, and the public's outrage was palpable. But amidst the chaos, the officer felt a sense of relief. He knew that this was the final blow to the corruption that had plagued the department for so long. The trials that followed were swift and decisive. The evidence was overwhelming, and the corrupt officers had no defense. One by one, they were found guilty and sentenced to lengthy prison terms. The officer watched as they were led away in handcuffs, their faces filled with anger and disbelief. It was a satisfying moment, but it was also bittersweet. The officer knew that the damage they had caused would take years to repair. In the aftermath of the trials, the officer turned his attention to rebuilding the department. He worked closely with the oversight committee, the new leadership, and the community to implement the reforms they had fought so hard for. They focused on increasing transparency, improving training, and fostering a culture of accountability. It was a slow and challenging process, but the officer was determined to see it through. One of the most significant changes was the creation of a community advisory board, which gave residents a direct voice in shaping the department's policies and practices. The officer also pushed for the establishment of a mental health and wellness program for officers, recognizing the toll that the job could take on their mental and emotional well-being. These changes were met with widespread support, and the department began to regain the trust of the community. As the months passed, the officer began to see the fruits of his labor. Crime rates dropped, and the relationship between the department and the community improved. Officers were more engaged, and residents felt safer and more connected to the people who were supposed to protect them. It was a far cry from the dark days of corruption, and the officer felt a deep sense of pride in what they had accomplished. But even as he celebrated the progress, the officer knew that the fight for justice was never truly over. There would always be new challenges, new threats, and new battles to fight. But he also knew that he had made a difference. He had shown that one person, no matter how powerful the forces against them, could stand up for what was right and make a lasting impact. One evening, as the officer was walking through the neighborhood he had fought so hard to protect, he was approached by a group of children. They looked up at him with wide eyes and asked, "Are you the hero who took down the bad cops?" The officer smiled and knelt down to their level. "I'm just someone who stood up for what's right," he said. "And you can be heroes too. All you have to do is stand up for what's right, even when it's hard." The children nodded, and the officer felt a surge of hope. He knew that the fight for justice would continue, but he also knew that he had inspired a new generation to carry on the work. And as long as there were people willing to stand up for what was right, he knew that change was possible. As he walked away, the officer felt a sense of peace. He had come a long way, and there was still much to do. But he was ready. He had the evidence, the truth, and the support of the people. And he was determined to see this through to the end.